Hey guys, I decided it would be a nice change of pace to review a modern horror game on my channel for once. So here is my review of the recently released Resident Evil 4 remake. So the RE4 remake is easily one of the best remakes I've ever played. It makes several improvements on the... sorry guys, I just got to go back to get Ashley. Okay, we're good. Fuck. Okay, fuck this. Yomawari Midnight Shadows is a survival horror game developed by Nippon Ichi Software and released in 2017 for the PS Vita, PS4 and PC. Yomawari Midnight Shadows is the sequel to the PS Vita title Yomawari Night Alone, although it is not necessary to have played that game to be able to follow along with the plot of Midnight Shadows. Yomawari Midnight Shadows received generally favourable reviews from critics, who praised the game's terrifying atmosphere, touching story, and beautiful hand-drawn art. However, some critics also considered the game to be too similar to its predecessor, and that it didn't do enough new to warrant its existence. As someone who has played both games, however, I have no problem telling you that Midnight Shadows is easily the superior game in my opinion. The story is significantly more compelling, and the gameplay has been tweaked in a number of subtle ways, like the inclusion of indoor areas and having tighter level design. In fact, if you are new to the Yomawari series, I'd recommend just skipping Night Alone altogether and moving straight on to Midnight Shadows, but I am getting ahead of myself. Yomawari Midnight Shadows begins with an entry from a young girl's diary. In it, we are told that the girl's name is Yui, and that her dog died yesterday. We are then shown Yui visiting the woods in order to bury her dog, although it is very clear that she still has a very much alive dog, so I don't understand why she's making such a big deal about all this. Shortly after burying her dog, Yui's other dog, Chako, runs off further into the forest, and the player is given control of Yui. This section serves as Yomawari's tutorial, where the player is instructed on how to move, run, tiptoe, push objects, and various other actions. Eventually, Yui finds her dog, but for some reason, she decides to throw a stone in order to distract him, while she quietly slips away by herself. A short trek later, and Yui arrives at a tree, where she decides to hang a noose from one of the branches.
The preceding program contained scenes of extreme violence and should not have been viewed by young children.
This scene really caught me off guard the first time I played Midnight Shadows. I wasn't expecting this cutesy horror game to begin with a child committing suicide. And unlike most child deaths shown in video games, there is nothing funny about the way Yui dies. It's brutal and could be very upsetting to a lot of people. We are then shown a flashback of Yui and her close friend Haru attending a fireworks festival. While at the festival, Haru tells Yui that this will probably be the last night they will spend together, since Haru is moving away at the end of the summer. However, a short time later, Haru decides that she is never leaving and will stay in town with her friend, no matter what. Once the fireworks have ended, Yui and Haru decide to head home. However, since it has gotten very dark, they need to use their flashlight to find their way around. A short time later, Haru begins hearing voices around her and asks Yui to go and investigate by herself. Yui finds a red leash a short distance away, which leads to one of the best fourth wall breaking jump scares I have ever experienced in a video game. Yui is apparently caught by the strange creature, and we are put in control of Haru, who will become our main protagonist for the rest of the game. Haru begins searching for Yui, but it isn't long before she also comes face to face with the terrifying monsters of this town. This is the first proper chase sequence in the game, and is a good opportunity to get used to how the stamina meter works. So usually while exploring the town, Haru will be able to run for a decent length of time. However, whenever she is panicked or getting chased by a monster, her heart rate will increase, and she will run out of breath much quicker. You can refill your stamina gates by walking for a few moments instead of running, but something the game doesn't tell you is that you can actually refill your stamina gates much quicker by holding down the tiptoe button for a few seconds. You will need to get used to how the stamina gauge works very quickly if you plan to avoid dying dozens of times within the first few hours of the game. While being chased by the monsters, Haru eventually finds a bush which she can hide in. Since you can't fight back against the monsters in Midnight Shadows, finding a place to hide is sometimes the only way to get rid of any enemies currently chasing you. Shortly after escaping the woods, Haru decides to visit Yui's house, but unfortunately she has not yet made it home. Haru decides to leave a letter for Yui before finally heading home for the night. We are then once again put in control of Yui, as she awakens in what looks to be a construction yard with no idea of how she got there. This is a short linear sequence where we simply have to get Yui from point A to B without much in the way of enemies or ways to perish. While exploring the town, Yui finds a torn magazine on the ground. All she is able to make out from the magazine are the words, "If you run into it, hands, feet and neck, give them." Yui has no idea what any of this means, but it will be invaluable information for the player soon enough. Yui comes across a trail of blood on the road, and like all great characters in horror fiction, decides it would just be the best idea ever to follow it. The blood trail leads her to quite a disconcerting note lying on the ground. If there is one thing Yomawari Midnight Shadows does phenomenally well, it's building tension. Instead of just showing the monster at the first possible opportunity, it gives the player just enough time to let their imaginations run wild about what might be lurking around the next corner, which can really heighten the anxiety felt while playing this game. It isn't long, however, until Yui finds a severed hand on the ground, and things go from bad to worse. Haru has still not heard from Yui, and so decides to go out again to look for her. Before leaving the house, however, you are able to choose a charm to wear. These charms come with different benefits depending on which one you choose. For example, one charm may allow you to run for longer, while another will allow you to carry more pebbles, which are items you can use to distract enemies. Once you have picked a charm, you can then leave the house and begin your search for Yui. From here on out, you pretty much have full access to the town, except for a few areas that will become unlocked as you make more progress through the story. You can go almost anywhere, and the sheer size of the town can feel pretty overwhelming at first. Thankfully, you also have an easy to navigate map that highlights all the important landmarks in town and how to get to them. You will be looking at this map very frequently, as it will be your best friend in figuring out how to get around the town during the first few hours of the game. Also, can I just say how impressive this map is, considering that it was drawn by a child. It is certainly a lot more impressive than my map, so all I have to do is get a job, and then get a house, and then I get Daddy's love. Yeah, soon. Soon. I am sane. It's Friday, getting on down on Friday. Everybody's looking forward to the weekend week. But what will you be doing around town in Midnight Shadows, I hear you ask? Well, you can simply follow the main quest if you want, which is of course to find Yui. But by going off the beaten path in town, you can find optional items, side quests, and even more bizarre creatures that you would never have encountered during the main campaign. There is a lot of meaningless junk to pick up in Yomawari, and most of it is useless, But if you want to get the complete story and learn more about the town and its inhabitants, it's worth completing as much side content in the game as possible. Regardless of whether you choose to complete side content or continue your search for Yui, you are going to be encountering a lot of weird and wonderful creatures in town. The monster design in Midnight Shadows is probably my favourite aspect of the game. They are also brilliantly designed and creative. Yomawari Midnight Shadows really feels like something Studio Ghibli would dream up if they were ever asked to make a horror game. The game just exudes the kind of creativity you'd commonly find from that studio. Not all monsters in town are harmful to the player, but most are, and you will need to employ different tactics for each if you are to successfully survive for any length of time. For example, these little black creatures are scared of the light and will cover their eyes when your flashlight is shone on them. However, as soon as you turn your back on them, they will begin to chase after you. They are actually very similar to the boos from the Super Mario series now that I think about it. There are also creatures that require you to pay attention to the environment around you. For instance, every time you see tire marks on the road, you will know that you are about to encounter these flaming tire creatures. Or if you see a ball bouncing out in front of you, you'll know some child demon thing is about to run out after it. Unfortunately, there is quite a lot of trial and error to figuring out many of Yomawari's monsters, and you are going to die a lot before you have learned how to effectively deal with the majority of them. There are also a lot of bullshit gotcha deaths that the player will have almost no chance of avoiding during their first playthrough. I mean, can someone please explain to me how the fuck I was supposed to know this random wardrobe was going to produce spikes that instantly killed me? There were even a handful of occasions where I could not even begin to explain how I died. I mean, take this section. I'm just running along and blam, dead. It wasn't until I replayed this section that I figured out that a woman actually falls from the sky and will instantly kill you if you happen to be running at that time. I mean, how the fuck was I supposed to know that? So when you die in Midnight Shadows, and trust me, you will die, you are sent back to the last save point you used. Similar to classic survival horror games like Resident Evil and Silent Hill, there is no autosave in Yomawari Midnight Shadows. The game will only save when you visit these statues littered around the town, and even then, you need to have a coin in order to be able to save. Coins are littered everywhere around town, and aren't difficult to find, but you still need to be careful not to save every 5 seconds, or you might find yourself unable to save your progress when you really need to. These statues also serve as fast travel points, so that you can quickly warp between areas in town. A very useful feature, especially if you are planning on going for 100% completion. Anyways, getting back to the story, Haru continues her search for Yui, but it isn't long before she comes face to face with one of the most terrifying monsters of the entire series, Mr. Kotowari. Mr. Kotowari is pretty much this game's nemesis character, consistently showing up throughout the game to pursue the player and to give them a goddamn heart attack. He carries a large pair of scissors that will make short work of Haru if she comes into contact with them. Running away and dodging his attacks are all you can really do against this guy. Mr. Kotowari is a terrifying adversary that will stay with the player long after they have completed the game. Anyways, Haru eventually finds a doll lying on the ground and attempts to offer it to Mr. Kotowari in the hopes it will convince him to stop pursuing her. Amazingly, the plan works, and Mr. Kotowari vanishes into thin air, at least for the time being. And that's about all I want to spoil regarding this game's story. Midnight Shadows' narrative deserves to be experienced as spoiler-free as possible. I mean, I probably should have told you that before I went on to spoil a significant portion of the story, but that would have required me to write a second draft of this review, and no way in hell was I doing that.
I wrote a script and I gave it to a guy who reads scripts, and he read it and he said he really likes it, but he thinks I need to rewrite it. I said, fuck that, I'll just make a copy.
Midnight Shadow tells an emotionally draining story about friendship and learning how to deal with loss. The fact that the two protagonists of this game are young girls just makes some of the more heartbreaking moments hit 10 times harder. The ending got to me more than I like to admit, and I even ended up shedding a few tears, which is not something I expected to do, given the cutesy aesthetic of this game. Speaking of the game's cutesy visuals, I didn't expect Yomawari Midnight Shadows to be so fucking terrifying. I felt a genuine sense of unease practically the entire time I was playing the game. You just never know what could be around the next corner, and that uncertainty, mixed with the game's very effective jump scares, meant that I never felt safe in this world. Honestly, I don't think I've ever played a game that has caused me to nearly jump out of my skin as many times as Midnight Shadows has. Despite its cartoony visuals and cutesy protagonists, this is as genuine a survival horror experience as you are likely to find. Death comes fast and often. There is no autosave system, and you must use limited items found in the world in order to save your progress. Your resources are limited and must be used wisely, and there is an emphasis on exploration and light puzzle solving. Yomawari Midnight Shadows really does feel like an old school survival horror game from the 90s, and fans of the genre will find a lot to love here. Yomawari Midnight Shadows' soundtrack is unfortunately not much to write home about. Aside from a truly beautiful credits theme, there is practically no music to speak of in this game. Most of the time, the only sounds you will hear will be Haru's footsteps and the quiet ambience of the city around you. Of course, the monsters will also make awful noises when they are nearby, which is useful as sometimes you won't know where the enemy is, and so will have to rely on your hearing to pinpoint them. So Midnight Shadows' soundtrack is essentially peaceful silence, occasionally interspersed with some truly horrific screeching sound effects, which I'd also imagine is how many people would describe what it's like to listen to my voice. Or a Korn album. At the end of almost every chapter, the player will have to deal with a boss fight. These encounters are usually visually stunning, so I don't want to spoil them all here. They are also easily the most difficult sections of the game, as many of them require some degree of puzzle solving in order to survive. For example, one of my favourite sequences in the game involves being locked in a tiny room while all manner of objects and furniture are being hurled at you. It's a thrilling sequence, but the solution to completing this encounter is a bit obtuse. So earlier in the house you come across a few drawings done by a child. One of them in particular shows some kind of pillar with eyes on fire. However, you pick up this picture well before you actually find the pillar in question, so by the time you reach it, it is very probable that you've forgotten about the child's drawing entirely. I appreciate that the game can be a bit cryptic at times though. Midnight Shadows does not treat the player like an idiot and expects them to be able to use their brains every now and then. If only my girlfriend had that same amount of faith in me. Or my parole officer for that matter. Yomawari Midnight Shadows is a true hidden gem in the survival horror genre. Yes, it may look like a game targeted at children, but behind its cutesy facade is a terrifying experience that had me fraught with unease during my entire playthrough. It also tells a pretty heartbreaking story that is likely to get an emotional reaction from even the most cold-hearted of players. Gameplay is enjoyable, even if many sections require a degree of trial and error in order to complete. It's also not an incredibly long experience, with it being possible to wrap up the main story in about 4 to 5 hours. However, there is also a large amount of side content that will probably double your playtime if you choose to complete it. Yomawari Midnight Shadows is not a perfect game, but it's easily one of the best indie horror games of the last few years, and is a must play if you are a fan of the genre.